an honor to be with you today, and I thank you for your time here and for your interest. To the conference organizers, it's been perfect. Has anyone heard the Tobacco 7 in America? Have you heard of Philip Morris Company, tobacco company, called Altria now? Here, they've renamed themselves because no one liked the name Philip Morris anymore. What about R.J. Reynolds? These are tobacco companies in America. So in 1994, they came in front of a congressional committee in America, and they had noticed there's more than 7 here. Their experts were with them. These are PhDs that testified that no, smoking is fine. It's not addictive. It causes no problem. And all of them swore, as you see under oath, no, there's no problem with smoking. It's okay. It's not addictive. They're probably the only 7 people in the world that believe that. But they said it nevertheless. So what we have is a predatory industry of industry combined with science experts together telling the world it's okay. We have the same thing with porn, as we'll see. Now, going back to cigarettes. Now, we look back. These are real advertisements. This goes back over half a century ago, but can we believe this was real? Doctors, more doctors smoke Camels. This is my profession, MDs, than any other cigarette. Or how about this? This is a throat surgeon, okay? Notice at the top, in English, he says, give your throat a vacation. It's amazing. Oh, what about this one? More scientists and educators smoke Kent. Do you remember Joe Camel? Did you have Joe Camel here in Poland? Okay, in America they had Joe Camel. It was an advertisement. Notice how the camel in front is very young. Okay, it was adolescent. And initially, they said, you are trying to recruit teenagers to smoke. Camel said, no, we would not do that, right? The cigarette company. And yet they found these, you can go read these statements, that in their private memos, they were indeed trying to recruit young people. They knew they would have, as Gail said, customers for life. The porn industry does the same thing. This is an academic article that was published in a psychology journal by Lay, Prowse, and Finn. These are academic sexologists who are pro-porn. They believe porn is useful. And notice they say here that one possibility is that those with higher sexual sensation seeking pornography, i.e. people that want to watch pornography all day, begin at younger ages. They're advocating younger and younger people watch the porn. Because what they say is if they watch it, they won't have to do it. They'll have no desire to actually go out and do the acts. They'll be content with watching it. That makes sense, right? That's why advertisers spend so much money advertising, so we can watch the cars and not go buy them. Back to smoking. Pregnant women were encouraged to smoke. Some doctors would say, hey, you don't want to have a big baby, you can tear the birth canal, smoke and you will have a smaller baby. They said that in the past. Or getting away from cigarettes, what about vitamin donuts to feed your children? It's okay because we put vitamins in, yes? Or do you have a cough? This was 100 years ago, heroin cough syrup. It worked very well. You forgot about the cough. Now, fortunately, not all doctors agree with those, and today the American Society of Addictive Medicine, based on current neuroscience, has changed their definition of addiction. Instead of addiction just being a compulsion to use a chemical substance to the detriment or harm of the individual, now addiction is defined as a chronic disease of the brain affecting reward, motivation, and memory systems. And for the first time, the American Society of Addiction Medicine defined addictions as including non-substance behaviors as well. Food, gambling, and yes, sexuality. That these can affect the brain in similar ways. Why would they say that? Why would ASAM make this statement? How can cocaine and sex both cause similar changes in the brain? Now let's talk about the brain. Notice there are different lines from different parts of the brain. To your far right, you see a small circle. It says VTA. That's called ventral tegmental area. It is the dopamine center of the brain. What is dopamine? Dopamine is the desire chemical of your brain. It tells you what you want. It doesn't care about the consequences. It just says, get it, use it, feel it, it's good. Why does it do that? Because it rewards you for doing things that help you survive, like eat, like reproduce. The brain gives you a buzz, and it drives you with powerful engines of desire towards accomplishing what you want. Notice the wire goes to the left, and on the far left there's an NA with a small c, NA with a small c. That is the reward center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. All pleasure roads in the brain lead to that small almond-sized area in the center of the brain. And notice that that wire goes from the VTA to the NCA. The dopamine system of the brain powers the brain with this desire. Now, if you look up on the left, you see PFC. That's prefrontal cortex. It's this part of the brain in the front. It's your thinking part of the brain. It's your judgment part of the brain. It tells you, I may like chocolate cake, but if I eat a full chocolate cake 3 times a day, every day, I will not have good consequences, right? So maybe I better not do it, even though my dopamine says yes. My thinking brain says, maybe not such a good idea, right? It's that judgment part of our brain. There are consequences. Think about it. Remember those 3 areas. We will come back to them as we go along. These areas are interconnected, and they affect each other very powerfully. Now, what happens when a person takes methamphetamine and injects it into their body and it hits their brain? What happens to the dopamine spike in the nucleus accumbens? Look on the far left. It goes up 1,000% with methamphetamine. A person I knew that was addicted to methamphetamine said it's like getting on a rocket and accelerating. It's fabulous. He said it feels incredible. In fact, when a person has used meth, they usually never want anything else again. Now, everything else in their life is measured by that cocaine ride. Notice that cocaine, over 300% spike of the dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Nicotine, 250. Morphine, 200% spike. What about natural rewards? Notice to the left, food, 150% spike. And to the right, sexual orgasm, 200%, which is equivalent to morphine. So heroin rush is equivalent to sexual orgasm. That is the most powerful single reward in the human brain. This is a simple diagram of what's called the hedonic set point of the brain. Think of it as your pleasure thermostat. What is it that is pleasurable to you? There's a certain line. Above that, pleasurable. Below that, not so good. Addiction changes that by changing the number of dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens. And we now know that it doesn't matter whether it's heroin or cocaine, which changes this. There's some good studies on food addiction, and it shows lower dopamine receptors, just like cocaine. So it changes the pleasure thermostat. There's a new normal now. The previous buzz doesn't do it anymore. With pornography, the softcore, the Marilyn Monroe centerfold in the first issue of Playboy doesn't compare with Max Hardcore anymore. What happens now? I showed you the diagram before. These are diagrams of actual brain cells. And that dopamine cell on the left with addiction, there's another diagram I didn't have time to show today, but it shows that with addiction, it shrinks. It gets smaller because the brain has a feedback mechanism. It says, I like pleasure, but this is too much. You're killing me. My purpose as a pleasure system in your brain is to help you survive. It's to be a garnish of life, not the main course. That's what happens with addiction. What is neuroplasticity? It means that the brain is plastic. It changes. We used to think that similar to doing pottery, when you mold clay into a pot on a potter's wheel and you change the clay, that the brain could be changed until we became emerging adults and then finally adults. And then we thought that we took that clay and placed it in a kiln and fired the clay, and it became a ceramic pot, fixed, immutable, no change. That is not true. 20 years ago, we learned that that is completely not true, that adults have a neuroplastic brain as well. And as one author said in a neuroplastic study of how the brain changes, the brain is the source of behavior, but in turn is modified by the behaviors it produces. Learning sculpts brain structure. It changes the brain. One of the powerful chemicals in the brain that causes the brain to change is delta phos B. What is that? It's a protein that many years ago we found was elevated in cocaine addiction and other addictions. And it didn't go down. It stayed elevated. So it was a signaling cascade. It was part of a group of chemicals that drove the organism to use the substance. And if the delta phosphate was too high, the animal overused the substance. And then in the last 10 years, we found with laboratory models that delta phosphate is elevated in the brains of animals that overconsume natural rewards, such as food and, yes, sex. And these animals then have a hypersexual behavior that is more than an animal usually does. So it's a very powerful model for what happens at the chemical level in our brain that models addiction. Based on this and other things, I wrote a paper in 2011, published it in a medical journal called Surgical Neurology International as an editorial. Me and another neurosurgeon wrote this, and we predicted that based on the delta phosphate data and what we know about sex, we would find that pornography would show some of the same brain changes, which I will talk about in a minute, that we see with cocaine and drugs, we would also see with pornography. A group from an academic institution that was pro-pornography said, no, that's not true. The brain can never change. We wrote back and had a back and forth rebuttal in the peer-reviewed literature in this journal about that. Now, 4 years later, we have been proven right and vindicated in this. I will show you some studies that pornography does change the brain. This is a paper that was published initially. Notice on the left, you see a long wire, and on the right, you see the same wire, but you see now more sprouts coming out on the side. Do you see that? This is a brain wire going between brain cells, and what happens is in cocaine, when a person is addicted to cocaine, the left is not addicted, the right is addicted. They grow new sprouts. What does that represent? These sprouts represent desire. It represents learning that something feels very good. I do not want to forget that. We call this dendritic arborization for a fancy word, but it just means the brain is growing new sprouts to try to remember the pleasure. We saw this first in drugs, and then in 2002, a paper was published, and we found that this was true with a natural craving, salt craving. In animals, if they don't, particularly animals that don't eat meat, if they don't have enough salt, they will die. And if you take salt away from the animal, they develop an intense craving for salt, like a drug addiction craving. When you give them the salt, they drink a salt solution as if they're going to die. And so in looking at that, they found that yes, when you give the animal salt, their brain does this same arborization. It grows new sprouts just as if it was cocaine. This was very interesting. And then a few years ago, the same study was done with animals, a laboratory model, looking at sex. And when an animal experienced sex for the first time, this happened in their brain because it was such a new and powerful experience of pleasure for the animal. These were animals that were previously naive to sex. They had not had sex, and they were introduced. It just shows that sex itself is a very powerful reward. Now, what happens to our brain? We talked about the brain changes, right? So what these footprints that Dr. Lewis talked about are actually real. The brain changes with the way it actually looks, physically. Amazing, I know, but it's true. For instance, recently, a study was done in 2006 with British medical students. They scanned their brains before and after a 3-month period of intense studying for exams. And guess what they found? The part of the brain that acquires diffuse knowledge grew. It got bigger. It actually got larger with learning. Physically, you could scan it and measure it. It's a technique called voxel-based morphometry or structural MRI. Amazing, but it completely has changed the way we think. The first study was done 20 years ago with violin players. In scanning the brains of violin players, we found that the part of the brain that controls the left hand on the violin player gets bigger the more the violin player practices and the earlier they start to play. So based on this, these are not merely correlations. These are causations. Our brains cause. They sculpt. Learning sculpts our brains. It changes us. It's been seen with juggling as well. Now, what about addiction? Does addiction have a footprint? Do we see changes with addiction? We do. We see shrinkage. We see shrinkage in the reward area. We see changes in the frontal reward area as well. We've seen this with cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, obesity. We saw it with a pedophile study. The sexuality was a pedophile study. And more recently, in 2011, internet addiction. And last year in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, a study out of Germany by Kuhn and Associates looking at pornography. And yes, it's associated with a shrunken reward area that looks very similar to the other drug addictions. So, going back to our 2011, the doctors said pornography will never show a change in the brain. And we've now been vindicated with this study. In fact, the internet study said, we suggest that long-term internet addiction would result in structural brain alterations, contributing to these chronic dysfunctions. Going back to the pornography study then, the one from Germany, they found that this striatal area, this pleasure area, gets smaller and there is decreased frontal connectivity. Remember the frontal area we saw, this thinking part of the brain? The ability of that thinking part to connect to the pleasure area, to modulate pleasure, is decreased. And the more hours viewing per week, the more the changes in the brain. So they concluded, well, it could reflect neuroplasticity, which means it's actually causing the shrinkage, or we have to say this because it's just a snapshot. Maybe all these people are born pre-shrunken and thus doomed to watch pornography. Number two, maybe some are predisposed. No question there's a 50% association with addiction. However, knowing what we know about medical students juggling everything else about neuroplasticity, at least part we can surmise with scientific, in my opinion, certainty, that there is almost certainly causation involved. Otherwise, pornography would be the only learning activity that doesn't change your brain. How likely is that? Juggling, yes. Pornography, no. I don't think so. Now, Valerie Voon at Cambridge University in England did a study which published last year as well, looking at incentive sensitization. What is that? Well, it turns out when you use a different kind of MRI scan, that is a scan that looks not at structure, but at function. We find that individuals that are addicted to drugs, and this is going back to the early cocaine addiction studies, that when you show them a picture of a line of cocaine, their brain reacts very differently. It's very interested. It lights up in a very different way than someone that is not addicted. In someone that is not addicted, they will see the white powder and say, someone spilled the flour. It won't mean anything to them. In a cocaine addict, they will fire their nucleus accumbens, and you will see this spike. So Valerie Voon looked at severe porn addiction, and she found that the brain incentive sensitization studies looking at fMRI looked almost identical to the cocaine studies. And this study was published last year. She also found that there is a wanting-liking split, which is a hallmark of addiction, seen with pornography. It had previously been seen with alcohol and other drugs. In other words, because of the receptor downgrading, and it takes a much larger dose of the drug, of the behavior, to get the same effect, it's been found that a person that's addicted to alcohol gets to where they crave alcohol, but in the end they may not even like it. They do it just to kill the pain. And pornography addiction can show the same wanting-liking split. This also was found in her paper. Now, Kaur and Malinka at Stanford University published a paper on how brain cells change with addiction. And in this paper on brain cell changes, they said addiction represents a pathological yet powerful form of learning and memory. And it does. I think perhaps nothing else, perhaps no addiction other than pornography causes this to be more true in terms of the way it changes brain patterns. Pornography is an intensive exercise in clicking, in searching, in novelty. Our brains like something new. It provides an powerful sensitization for neuroplastic change in the brain. It damages working memory. Remember we talked about those frontal areas in Kuhn's paper, how they're decreased the more? Well, another study looked at actual function of memory and found those with pornography addiction have decreased working memory as well. What about adolescents? What about children? Delta Phos-B, we talked about a minute ago, we found is much more potently elaborated and produced in adolescents than in adults. They are much more susceptible to addiction. They are hardwired for it. And two, these frontal executive control centers are not fully operational until the mid-20s. So we have now 18-year-old girls being coerced, being enticed to come do hardcore porn. At 18 years old, we may say it's legal, but is it right? It may be another decade before they can fully understand the informed consent of the consequences of what they are doing. And yet, as a society, culturally, as an international culture, we blink and ignore this fact as we sacrifice our next generation on the altar of a predatory industry. What about mirror systems? Mirror systems mirror our brains. We found years ago that there are certain areas of our brains that project us into what we watch. It's as if we're there. They're called mirror systems. In a study looking at pornography, and these scientists found out that if you look at the mirror systems with fMRI of individuals watching pornography, that they are in the movie. They are in the films. They said, we suggest that the mirror neuron system prompts the observers to resonate with the motivational state of other individuals appearing in visual depictions of sexual interactions. They are there. It projects them into the movies. 14-year-old Johnny is the male pornography actor. And Bill Margold said that. This is from Gail's book. Quote, he said, this is what Bill said, I'd really like to show what I believe the men want to see, violence against women. I firmly believe we serve a purpose in showing that. The most violent we can get is ejaculation in the face. Men get off on that because they get even with the women they can't have. We try to inundate the world with orgasms in the face. That is Junior's pornography instructor, is Bill. Your 12 to 14-year-old son will learn what sex is from Bill, and he's watching a supernormal stimulus to do so. Gail has already talked about this study. 90% of the scenes showing aggression towards women. And yet, what do the pro-porn people say? They say, based on studies from years ago, rape is going down, they said, and porn is going up. So guess what? More porn, less rape. Two problems. Number one, it's correlation. These PhDs should know better than to infer causation from a correlative study, number one. Number two, it's not true. Now we know that the rates are all going sky high. For instance, 58,000 rapes by UN peacekeepers of girls in Monrovia, and yet only 65 recorded. This was last week out of a UN report. Underreporting, and that's happened in the United States. This paper came out, Corey Young wrote it in the Iowa Law Review Journal. He found how to lie with rape statistics. Instead of experiencing the widely reported great decline in rape, America is in the midst of a hidden rape crisis. Look at the American military, look at college campuses, look at India, look all over the world. Rape is increasing, it's being hidden. As Jim Powers, pornographer, said, now they are 19, they are hookers, they don't care. They're a throwaway commodity in a throwaway world. I had the opportunity to speak a couple of months ago to a medical school. This was in Iowa, and I thought of this picture, which I had used before. In June 30th of 2010, a couple was in a boat in the Iowa River. The engine went out in the boat, and the boat went over a short waterfall. Just before the boat went over, some people saw the man give the only life jacket in the boat to his wife, Patricia. Alan Neely gave the only life jacket to his wife. They went over, the boat was gone. Patricia was stranded in the water, about to drown. Alan lost his life. Several rescue crews tried to rescue her, no avail. They couldn't do it. Jason Oglesby was a construction worker. He was not a rescue worker. He was watching this sad tragedy. They were watching, all the people lined up on the shore watching this woman about to drown, caught in the current beneath the waterfall. He went and got his construction supervisor. He had them chain his construction chain around him, and they lowered him into the water, and he reached down and he lifted Patricia out of the water. Mary Chind, for the local paper, saw it. She clicked, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. You can see why, right? This is what we are. This represents men and women interacting, what we really are. I think it represents the best in us. I believe that we can do better. I think that we're more than what Steve Hirsch tells us we are. I think we have a better world in front of us than MindGeek would tell us we have. I would challenge each of us to take the challenge to go forth today and make this a better world. Thank you.
you.